Welcome back to the Historian's Tome. I'm so glad you're here with us tonight. Before we begin our journey into one of history's most dramatic moments, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these stories from the past. I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? Is it late evening where you are, or perhaps early morning? Whatever time it is, I hope you're comfortable and ready to travel back nearly 1,000 years to witness the Norman Conquest. So settle in, close your eyes if you wish, and let's begin our story. The year was 1066 and England stood at a crossroads. On January 5th, King Edward the Confessor lay dying in his palace at Westminster. He had ruled England for nearly 24 years, but he had no children to inherit his throne. This simple fact would change the course of history forever. Edward had lived a peaceful life, more interested in building churches than fighting wars. His greatest achievement was Westminster Abbey, which had just been completed. But as he lay on his deathbed, surrounded by his closest advisers, the question of succession hung heavy in the air like morning fog over the Thames. There were several men who believed they had a right to the English throne. Each had their own claim, their own reasons, their own ambitions. The most powerful man in England at that moment was Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex. He was Edward's brother-in-law and had been running the kingdom's affairs for years. Harold was a proven military commander, respected by the English nobles and trusted by the people. But across the English Channel in Normandy, Duke William had his own ideas. William believed that Edward had promised him the throne years earlier, back in 1051. According to Norman sources, Edward had sent messengers to William guaranteeing him the succession. William also claimed that Harold himself had sworn an oath to support William's claim to the throne, though Harold would later dispute this. There was also Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway. He was one of the most feared warriors in all of Europe, standing nearly 7 feet tall. Harald based his claim on an old agreement between previous kings of Norway and England. He had spent his life fighting from the frozen north to the warm Mediterranean, and he had never lost his appetite for conquest. On January the 5th, Edward the Confessor died. According to those present, his last words designated Harold Godwinson as his successor. The very next day, January the 6th, Harold was crowned King of England in the newly finished Westminster Abbey. The speed of the coronation was unusual, but Harold knew he needed to establish his authority quickly. He understood that challenges would come, and they would come soon. News of Edward's death and Harold's coronation spread across Europe like wildfire. In Normandy, William was furious. He felt betrayed, cheated of what he believed was rightfully his. In Norway, Harald Hardrada prepared his longships, and in England Harold II began to prepare his kingdom for the storm that was coming. Harold was not a fool. He knew that his crown sat uneasily on his head. He immediately began strengthening England's defences, particularly along the south coast where he expected William to land. He called up the Fulford, the Anglo-Saxon militia made up of ordinary farmers and townsmen who were obligated to serve in defence of the realm. He also assembled his housecarls, professional warriors who formed the backbone of his army. The English military system was different from the Norman one. While the Normans relied heavily on mounted knights, the English fought primarily on foot. The housecarls were formidable warriors who wielded huge two-handed axes that could cut through armour and horseflesh with equal ease. They were disciplined, loyal, and deadly. As winter turned to spring and spring to summer, Harold waited. He kept his army mobilized along the southern coast, watching the horizon for Norman ships. The waiting was exhausting both for Harold and his men. Keeping an army in the field for months was expensive and difficult. The farmers who made up much of the Fulford needed to return home for the harvest, or there would be famine. By early September, Harold had no choice. His supplies were running low and his men were growing restless. The harvest needed to be brought in. Harold made the difficult decision to demobilize most of his forces. He sent the Fulford home and allowed his ships to return to London. He believed that the sailing season was nearly over and that William would not risk a late autumn crossing of the English Channel. Harold was wrong, but the first attack would not come from Normandy. It would come from the north. On September 18th, Harald Hardrada landed in northern England with a massive Norwegian fleet. He had brought 300 ships and somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 warriors. With him was Harold Godwinson, Harold's own brother, who had been exiled from England the previous year and now sought revenge. The Norwegian army marched inland toward the city of York. On September 20th, they met an English army at Fulford, just outside the city. The local earls, Edwin and Morcar, had gathered their forces to defend the north, but they were badly outnumbered. The Battle of Fulford was a crushing defeat for the English. Edwin and Morcar barely escaped with their lives, and York surrendered to the Norwegians. When news reached Harold in London, he immediately understood the danger. He could not allow the Norwegians to establish themselves in the north. He had to act quickly, even though most of his army had been disbanded. Harold gathered whatever forces he could and began a forced march northward that would become legendary. Harold covered nearly 200 miles in just 4 days, an astounding feat for a medieval army. He gathered additional troops as he marched, and by the time he reached the north, he had assembled a formidable force. His rapid movement took the Norwegians completely by surprise. On September 25th, Harold's army reached Stamford Bridge, where the Norwegians had gathered to discuss terms with York and collect hostages. The Norwegians were not expecting a fight. Many had left their armor on their ships because the day was warm. They were scattered and unprepared when the English army appeared. The Battle of Stamford Bridge began at the bridge itself, where, according to legend, a single Norwegian warrior held off the entire English army. The story says he killed 40 Englishmen before someone floated under the bridge in a barrel and speared him from below. Whether this tale is true or not, we know that the fighting was fierce and bloody. The battle raged for hours under the September sun. Harald Hardrada was killed by an arrow to the throat. Tostig died fighting beside him. The Norwegian army was virtually destroyed. Of the 300 ships that had arrived, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. It was one of the greatest victories in English history. But Harold had no time to celebrate. 3 days after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy landed on the southern coast of England. William had been waiting for favourable winds for weeks. His invasion fleet had been ready since early August, but the winds had refused to cooperate. His army had grown restless, and some of his allies had begun to question whether the invasion would happen at all. Then on September 27th, the wind changed. William gave the order, and his fleet set sail. The Norman fleet consisted of around 700 ships carrying approximately 7,000 men, including 2,000 cavalry. This cavalry would prove to be the decisive factor in the coming battle. The Normans also brought archers, infantry, and all the supplies needed to support an army in hostile territory. William landed at Pevensey on September 28th and immediately began constructing fortifications. He then moved to Hastings and built a castle there. The Norman army began ravaging the surrounding countryside, burning villages and seizing supplies. William knew that Harold would have to respond, and he was right. When Harold received news of William's landing, he was still in York, nearly 300 miles away. He had just fought and won a major battle, and his army was exhausted. But once again, Harold had no choice but to march. He could not allow William to establish himself unopposed in the south. Harold made a crucial mistake. Instead of taking time to gather his full strength, he rushed south with whatever forces he could immediately muster. He wanted to surprise William just as he had surprised Harold Hardrada. But William was no Harold. The Norman Duke was prepared and waiting. Harold reached London on October 6th. He spent several days there gathering additional troops and supplies. His brothers urged him to wait, to let William exhaust himself and his supplies, but Harold was impatient. He may have been overconfident after his great victory at Stamford Bridge. Or perhaps he simply could not bear to see his lands ravaged by foreign invaders. Whatever his reasoning, Harold decided to march immediately. On October 13th, Harold's army reached the area near Hastings. He positioned his forces on Senlac Hill, blocking the road to London. His army was smaller than it should have been. Many of his best warriors had died at Stamford Bridge, and many others were still making their way south. But Harold had chosen his ground well. The hill gave him a strong defensive position, and William would have to attack uphill. The stage was set for one of the most famous battles in history. October 14th, 1066 dawned clear and cool. Harold's army held the high ground, arrayed in a shield wall across the ridge of Senlac Hill. This was the traditional English fighting formation, with warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping to create an almost impenetrable barrier. Behind the shield walls stood the housecarls with their fearsome two-handed axes. The Fyrd, the militia, filled out the rest of the line. Harold's army numbered somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 men. They were tired from their rapid march south, and many were still recovering from the Battle of Stamford Bridge. But they held a strong position, and they were fighting for their homeland. William's army approached from the south. It was organized in 3 divisions. The Bretons held the left, the Normans the centre, and a mixed force of Flemish and French knights held the right. William positioned his archers in front, his infantry in the middle, and his cavalry at the rear. This organization allowed him to use different types of forces in waves, wearing down the enemy. The battle began around 9 in the morning with a Norman arrow barrage. Thousands of arrows arced through the air and fell upon the English shield wall. But the English shields were strong, and the uphill angle reduced the effectiveness of the arrows. The English held firm. Next came the Norman infantry. They advanced up the hill and crashed into the shield wall. The fighting was brutal and close. Swords clashed against axes, shields splintered, and men died. But the English line held. The slope of the hill made it difficult for the Normans to generate momentum, and the English defenders had the advantage of height and position. Then William sent in his cavalry. The Norman knights charged up the hill, lances levelled, horses straining. It was an impressive and terrifying sight, but horses will not charge into a solid wall of men, and the English shield wall remained unbroken. The cavalry attack failed, and the Norman knights retreated back down the hill. What happened next is disputed by historians, but it may have saved William's invasion. The Bretons on the Norman left flank broke and ran. Whether this was a genuine rout or a planned feint is unclear, but the result was the same. A portion of the English army, seeing the enemy retreat, broke formation and charged down the hill in pursuit. This was exactly what the English should not have done. Their strength lay in their shield wall and defensive position. Once they left that position, they became vulnerable. William seized the opportunity. His cavalry wheeled around and cut down the pursuing English soldiers. It was a slaughter. Despite this setback, the main English line still held. Hours passed and the battle continued. William tried everything. More arrow barrages, more infantry assaults, more cavalry charges. Nothing could break the English shield wall. Some Norman sources claim that William had 3 horses killed under him during the battle, and that rumours spread through his army that he had been killed. William had to ride among his troops with his helmet raised so they could see his face and know he still lived. As the afternoon wore on, William tried a new tactic. He ordered his knights to make a series of feint retreats, pretending to flee in panic. The hope was that more English soldiers would break ranks to pursue, just as they had earlier. The tactic worked, but not decisively. Small groups of English soldiers were killed, but the main shield wall remained intact. Then William ordered his archers to change their tactics. Instead of shooting directly at the shield wall, they began to shoot high into the air, sending their arrows plunging down from above. This made it much harder for the English to defend with their shields. Men began to fall, struck from above. According to tradition, it was during one of these arrow barrages that Harold was struck in the eye by an arrow. The famous scene depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry shows a figure labelled Harold with an arrow in his eye. However, some historians dispute this, suggesting that Harold may have been cut down by Norman knights in the final stages of the battle. What is certain is that as evening approached, the English line began to weaken. Hours of fighting had taken their toll. Men were exhausted, wounded, and demoralized. When Harold fell, whether from an arrow or a sword, the effect on English morale was devastating. William ordered a final, all-out assault. The Norman cavalry crashed into the wavering English line. This time, the shield wall broke. The English army collapsed and fled. The Norman knights pursued them through the gathering darkness, cutting down anyone they could catch. Harold's brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, died fighting beside their king. The cream of English nobility lay dead on Senlac Hill. The Battle of Hastings was over. William had won, but at a terrible cost. Thousands lay dead on both sides, and the battle had lasted nearly 9 hours. That night, William camped on the battlefield. According to Norman sources, he searched among the dead for Harold's body. When he found it, he had it buried in an unmarked grave. Other sources claim Harold's mother offered William her son's weight in gold for the body, but William refused. The battle was over, but the conquest had only just begun. After his victory at Hastings, William did not immediately march on London. This surprised many people at the time and has puzzled historians since. William had just defeated the English king and scattered his army. Why not press his advantage and seize the capital? The answer lies in William's cautious nature and his understanding of medieval warfare. His army had suffered heavy casualties at Hastings. His men were exhausted, and he needed time to consolidate his position. More importantly, William wanted the English to submit to him willingly if possible. A city taken by storm could be destroyed, its wealth lost, its people turned into permanent enemies. A city that surrendered peacefully could be taxed and controlled. William also had to deal with political realities back in Normandy. He could not afford to get bogged down in a long English campaign. He needed to establish control quickly and return home to manage his continental territories. So instead of marching directly on London, William spent several weeks securing the southeastern counties. He captured Dover and its crucial castle, despite the garrison setting fire to the town. He then moved to Canterbury, where he stayed for a month while his army recovered and reinforcements arrived from Normandy. In London, meanwhile, the surviving English leaders faced a crisis. Harold was dead, his brothers were dead, and much of the English nobility had fallen at Hastings. But England still had resources and armies in the north and west that had not fought at Hastings. The question was whether to continue resistance or submit to William. The English leaders in London chose a young man named Edgar the Atheling as king. Edgar was the grandson of King Edmund Ironside and had a strong claim to the throne by blood. He was only about 14 years old, which made him easy to control, but also meant he had no power of his own. The northern earls, Edwin and Morcar, who had survived the Battle of Fulford, gave Edgar their support, but their own forces had been badly weakened. In theory, England could still mount a defence. In practice, the will to resist was crumbling. Many English nobles began to calculate that submission to William might be preferable to a long and destructive war. William encouraged this thinking by treating those who submitted generously and punishing those who resisted harshly. William's march toward London was slow and deliberate. He did not take the direct route, but instead circled around the city, burning and destroying as he went. This devastation served multiple purposes. It showed the cost of resistance, it isolated London from potential reinforcements, and it allowed William to live off the land while denying resources to his enemies. William crossed the Thames at Wallingford, where he received the submission of Stigand, the Archbishop of Canterbury. This was a significant moment. Stigand was one of the most powerful churchmen in England, and his submission gave William's claim a degree of religious legitimacy. From Wallingford, William continued his circular route, moving through Buckinghamshire and Hertfordshire. His army left a trail of destruction. The villages were burned, crops were seized, and anyone who resisted was killed. The message was clear: submit or suffer. In London, the resistance collapsed. Edgar the Atheling had been king for barely 2 months, but he had no army and no resources. The northern earls, seeing which way the wind was blowing, abandoned him. One by one, the English leaders decided that further resistance was futile. In early December, a delegation of English nobles met William at Berkhamsted. They offered him the crown of England. Among them were Edgar the Atheling himself, Archbishop Eldred of York, and the Earls Edwin and Morcar. They knelt before William and acknowledged him as their rightful king. William accepted their submission. He had won, but he made the English leaders wait. He did not immediately enter London or claim the throne. Instead, he kept them in suspense for several more weeks while he made preparations. This was a calculated move to demonstrate his power and make clear that he ruled by conquest, not by English gift. Finally, on Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was conducted by Archbishop Eldred, since Stigand's position was canonically irregular. The coronation followed English traditions, with the congregation being asked if they accepted William as their king. They shouted their approval in both English and French, but outside the abbey, Norman soldiers mistook the shouting for a riot and began setting fire to nearby buildings. Panic spread, and many people fled the church. The coronation continued amid smoke and confusion, with only William and the officiating clergy remaining calm. It was an ominous beginning to the Norman rule of England. William was now king, but his conquest was far from complete. He controlled the south and east, but much of the north and west remained hostile. Over the next few years, he would face multiple rebellions and would have to conquer his new kingdom again and again. The Norman Conquest did not end with William's coronation. In many ways, it was just beginning. William controlled the south of England, but the north and west remained largely independent and hostile. Over the next 5 years, he would face a series of rebellions that threatened to undo everything he had won at Hastings. William's first priority was to secure his new kingdom while also managing his territories in Normandy. He could not stay permanently in England, and this created problems. He needed English nobles and officials who would govern loyally in his absence, but he could not trust the old English elite who had only recently submitted to him. William's solution was to bring over Norman nobles and give them English lands and titles. This process happened gradually at first. William initially tried to work with the existing English nobility, confirming them in their lands and positions. But each rebellion changed his mind a little more. Each act of English resistance convinced him that the old elite could not be trusted. The first major rebellion came in 1067. While William was in Normandy dealing with continental affairs, several English nobles rose up in different parts of the country. In the southwest, the sons of Harold Godwinson launched raids from Ireland. In Wales, the border remained unsettled. In the north, the Earls Edwin and Morcar, who had submitted at Berkhamsted, began plotting rebellion. William returned quickly to England and crushed these rebellions with overwhelming force. He began building castles throughout the country, stone fortresses that allowed small Norman garrisons to control large areas of hostile territory. These castles were unlike anything England had seen before. They were symbols of Norman power and instruments of Norman control. In 1068, rebellion broke out again, this time centred in the north. The city of York rose against its Norman garrison. Edgar the Atheling, the teenage prince who had briefly been proclaimed king, fled to Scotland where he received support from King Malcolm. The northern earls joined the rebellion, and for a time it seemed that all of northern England might break away from Norman control. William's response was swift and brutal. He marched north with a large army in the winter of 1068–69, which was itself an unusual and difficult undertaking. He recaptured York and built 2 castles there to ensure it would not rebel again. He then continued north, building more castles and leaving garrisons to hold the territory. But the north was not finished. In 1069, a Danish fleet arrived on the east coast. The Danes were led by the sons of King Svein Estrithson of Denmark, who had his own claim to the English throne. The Danish fleet sailed up the Humber and joined forces with the English rebels. Together, they attacked York and destroyed the Norman garrison there. This was the most serious threat William had yet faced as king. A combination of Danish invasion and English rebellion could potentially overthrow him. William had to act decisively, and he did. He bought off the Danes with a large payment of silver, promising them they could stay in England for the winter and keep whatever they had plundered. This removed them from the conflict and isolated the English rebels. Then William turned his full attention to the north. What followed was one of the most brutal and controversial episodes in medieval English history. It became known as the Harrying of the North. William's army swept through Yorkshire and the surrounding counties in the winter of 1069–70, destroying everything in their path. They burned villages, killed livestock, destroyed crops and farming implements, and salted fields to prevent future cultivation. The goal was not just military victory, but the complete destruction of the North's ability to support rebellion. William wanted to create a wasteland where no army could live off the land. He succeeded horrifically. The Domesday Book, compiled nearly 20 years later, still described large areas of Yorkshire as waste. Contemporary chroniclers reported that people died by the thousands from starvation, and some even resorted to cannibalism. This campaign broke the back of English resistance in the north. It was a deliberate act of terror designed to show the cost of rebelling against Norman rule. William's reputation for mercy, never very strong, was destroyed, but he had achieved his objective. After the harrying of the north, there would be no more major English rebellions. There were still smaller revolts to deal with. In 1070, a rebel named Harold the Wake led a resistance movement from the Isle of Ely in the Fens. Hereward became a folk hero, a symbol of English resistance against Norman tyranny. His rebellion lasted until 1071, when William finally subdued the Fens. What happened to Hereward is unknown. He may have been killed or he may have escaped. His legend certainly survived. By 1072, William's conquest was essentially complete. He controlled all of England, and the last major English nobles had either submitted, fled abroad, or been killed. William made a symbolic expedition to Scotland, forcing King Malcolm to acknowledge his overlordship. The Domesday Book of 1086 shows the extent of the transformation. Of the approximately 180 major landholders in England, only 2 were Englishmen. The rest were Normans and other continentals. The old English aristocracy had been completely replaced. Their lands, their titles, their power, everything had been transferred to Norman lords who held their positions by military might and by loyalty to William. England had been conquered not just militarily but also socially and economically. The Norman Conquest changed England forever. It was not simply a change of rulers, but a fundamental transformation of English society, culture, language, and institutions. The effects of 1066 are still visible in Britain today, nearly 1,000 years later. The most immediate and obvious change was the replacement of the English ruling class with a Norman one. As we have seen, by 1086 almost all of England's major landholders were Norman. But the changes went deeper than just new names on old estates. The Normans brought with them a different social system, different laws, and different ways of organizing society. The feudal system that the Normans introduced to England was more systematic and more rigidly hierarchical than what had existed before. In theory, the king owned all the land. He granted portions of it to his tenants-in-chief, the great barons, in exchange for military service. They in turn granted portions of their land to lesser nobles, who granted land to knights, and so on down the hierarchy. Everyone owed service to someone above them, all the way up to the king. This system gave William unprecedented control over his new kingdom. Every significant landholder held their land directly or indirectly from the king, and their right to that land depended on their loyalty and service. This made rebellion much more difficult and expensive. If a baron rebelled, he risked not just his life but his lands and his family's future. The Normans also brought a passion for building in stone. Before 1066, England had some stone churches but very few stone castles or fortifications. The Normans built hundreds of castles, first simple wooden structures called motte and bailey castles, then later massive stone keeps. These castles served military, administrative, and symbolic purposes. They were bases for Norman garrisons, centres of local government, and visible demonstrations of Norman power. The Norman impact on church architecture was equally dramatic. The Normans rebuilt almost every major cathedral and abbey in England in the new Romanesque style they brought from the continent. Churches became larger, more elaborate, and more impressive. Durham Cathedral, Winchester Cathedral, and many others were built or rebuilt in the decades after 1066. Language changed too, though more slowly than government and architecture. The Norman Conquest introduced French as the language of the court, the law, and the aristocracy. For several centuries, England was effectively a bilingual nation, with French spoken by the elite and English by the common people. Over time, these languages began to blend, and by the late Middle Ages, a new form of English had emerged that incorporated thousands of French words. This is why modern English has so many words for the same thing, with the simpler word usually coming from Old English and the fancier word coming from French. We have cow, English, and beef, French, pig and pork, sheep and mutton. The pattern reflects the social division of the Norman period, where English peasants raised the animals and Norman nobles ate the meat. The legal system changed as well. The Normans brought continental legal traditions and merged them with existing English practices. The result was a unique hybrid system that would eventually evolve into English common law. William maintained that he was ruling by right, as Edward's legitimate heir, so he claimed to be continuing English legal traditions. But, in practice, Norman customs and procedures gradually reshaped English law. One of William's most remarkable achievements was the Domesday Book, compiled in 1086. This was a comprehensive survey of land ownership and resources throughout England. Royal officials travelled through every county, recording who held what land, how much it was worth, how many people lived there, how many ploughs they had, everything that could be taxed or counted. Nothing like it had been attempted before in medieval Europe. The Domesday Book had an immediate practical purpose. It allowed William to know exactly what resources he controlled and to ensure that he was receiving all the tax revenue he was entitled to. But it also served a deeper purpose. It was a statement of total control, a declaration that the king could enumerate and evaluate everything in his kingdom. The English called it the Domesday Book because its judgments, like those of the Last Judgment, could not be appealed. The conquest also changed England's relationship with the rest of Europe. Before 1066, England had been a maritime power with strong connections to Scandinavia. After 1066, England became part of a continental empire with its focus on France. For the next several centuries, English kings would hold substantial territories in France and would be as much French as English. This would lead to centuries of conflict culminating in the 100 Years' War. William himself never fully integrated into his new kingdom. He spent much of his reign travelling back and forth between England and Normandy, dealing with threats on both sides of the Channel. His sons would inherit this dual identity, ruling territories on both sides of the water and constantly struggling to hold them together. William died in 1087 after falling from his horse during a military campaign in France. His body was carried to Caen in Normandy for burial, but the funeral was chaotic. A fire broke out in the town, and then a local man interrupted the ceremony to claim that the church had been built on land stolen from his family. Even in death, William caused controversy. William's legacy is complex and contested. To the Normans and their descendants, he was William the Conqueror, a brilliant military commander and effective ruler who brought civilization and order to a backward England. To the English, he was William the Bastard, a foreign invader who destroyed their independence and subjected them to brutal foreign rule. The truth, as always, is more complicated. William was certainly brutal by modern standards. The harrying of the North was a war crime by any measure. But he was not exceptionally brutal by the standards of his own time. Medieval warfare was savage, and William's actions, while extreme, were not unique. What is undeniable is that William changed England forever. He replaced its ruling class, reshaped its institutions, influenced its language, and redirected its historical trajectory. The England that existed before 1066 was a relatively insular, Scandinavian-influenced kingdom on the edge of Europe. The England that emerged after the conquest was a powerful, centralized state with strong ties to the continent and a unique hybrid culture that blended English, Norman, and French elements. Today, nearly 1,000 years later, the effects of the Norman Conquest are still visible everywhere in England, in the language people speak with its mixture of Germanic and French-derived words, in the castles and cathedrals that dot the landscape, in the legal system and governmental institutions, in the very name of the ruling class, the aristocracy, which derives from French-speaking Norman nobles. The story of 1066 is more than just a story of battles and kings. It is the story of how a nation was conquered, transformed, and reborn. It is a reminder that history is made not just by armies and treaties, but by the countless ordinary people whose lives are forever changed by the ambitions of the powerful. The Norman Conquest was a catastrophe for many English people, destroying their world and subjecting them to foreign rule. But out of that catastrophe, over centuries, emerged something new, a unique culture and nation that would go on to shape world history in ways that neither William nor Harold could have imagined. The year 1066 stands as one of the great turning points in history, a moment when the old world ended and a new one began. And that, from beginning to end, is the entire story of the Norman Conquest. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through time. I hope you found this story as fascinating as I do. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe for more historical content. Until next time, sleep well and dream of history.